After 10 years, Nissan Sushi has finally released the next Z, and we're gonna talk about it. All right, so how did you feel when you actually saw the Z roll out onto the stage for the first time?
Okay, so to clarify, we just came out of the digital unveiling of the Z Proto. It's going to be the next Gen Z. They didn't clarify the name. I think they might just be calling it the Fair Lady Z, at least in Japan. So we'll see what we get in the US market. But my initial reaction was yikes, actually. As the car came out from the front, really not a fan of the front end. It kind of grew on me as the video goes on, but we'll talk about that more when we get into it. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't know what to expect. I started the video watching what appeared to be a 2006 montage of the various Z logos, and it looked like, honestly, I was watching Gran Turismo 4's intro video. So actually, when the car actually rolled onto the stage, I was like, wow, this actually looks like it could be really good. Definitely, you can kind of see like they're trying to go for that like 240, like older style Datsun look. The LEDs are a clear giveaway that it's like a modern car. So I was anticipating a little more than what actually ended up being revealed to us, which was like a giant yellow, like blob looking thing. Yeah. But I actually think let's be honest, they didn't talk about anything to do with performance or
no, this
track
was entirely
driving.
A design reveal, nothing more.
So, considering that it was all design stuff, obviously the looks of the car was pretty much all they had to talk about. I think actually it's like 90% of the way there. I agree with you. I'm not the biggest fan of the front end of the car. When I see it from the back, I'm like, oh, wow, this is like exactly what a modern 300 should look like. And then I see it from the side, I'm like, oh, wow, this is exactly what a modern 240 would look like. And then I see it from the front, and I'm like, it looks like day one intern of the Aston Martin dealership forgot how to use Photoshop. Like, I'm not sure what's going on with that grille, but I think the rest of the car looks actually really good.
Yeah, so during the reveal, I was on Instagram with some friends and fellow Z owners, and we were pretty much talking about the same thing, how the middle of the car, I'm going to call the middle basically the door area and the cross section from that across the body. That is cookie cutter 370Z. I mean, if you look, you can maybe see a little bit in the car behind me. It's got the same roof. It's got the same door. Even on the interior, you can see the door panel inside is identical. Then behind that, you get let's go with carbon copy of the 240Z, where you have the silver strip going down the quarter panel from the rear glass. And I love that. I think that's what they needed to do to begin with. It really creates a leaner body than the slightly bubbly hatchback design of the 370. It's not quite the 350's bubbly but lean era. We're definitely going back to more square, which I'm fine with. And it's more of the same as you get to the actual back, right? I mean, it's very 300ZX. They showed us that in a teaser prior to the reveal. That was basically the modern version of the 300ZX taillights. And I'm a big fan of that as well. No problems with that. It's a little weird seeing it go back to a very thin, or I should say short rear, where you have the diffuser actually being like half of the rear bumper rather than only the very bottom section. But I think it looks good. I think they integrated it well with the exhaust. And I'm curious to see how that reflects into like the future Nismo model with what's probably going to be a duckbill spoiler or something like that. Then my only real complaint is that front grille. I think the hood looks good. It's the 240 hood, more or less. The front quarter panel is great. I like the new headlights as well. I think my biggest complaint on the 370 coming from the 350 actually was that the headlights and the taillights are kind of outlandish. I mean, they're bigger than they need to be, and they have a pretty wicked design, which adds aggressiveness to the car, and I like it. It follows the lines really well, but it would have looked horrendous on this new body where you have a lot fewer lines, honestly. But I think the fewer lines were good, and I like the smaller, simpler headlights with much better looking technology. And then the front grille kind of just looks like they stopped there and forgot.
For as much as they talked about trying to harken back to the days of the 240, and it was sort of a weird juxtaposition of like, oh, we want the car to look like the 240, but we're bringing the technology of the 300, which, like, literally what? Like, why are we bringing the technology of the 300? Like, that car is not a technological advancement by any stretch of the imagination. But, I get that maybe they're, they have the taillights, so whatever. As much of a fan club we were for the 240 and, like, how we were trying to make this car look like the 240, literally what they don't talk about is that the 240 was around 40 years ago. That car, by no stretch of the imagination, can actually pass modern safety ratings,
Right.
modern pedestrian ratings. So what they have is a car that from the back end, which can't run into anything, looks like a 240, and then the front end is like this giant like wall that was probably in a wind tunnel and like has to have all this aero. So like it ends up like kind of falling short of what the 240 really actually looks like. So in that respect, you know, maybe they got too hooked on trying to look like the 240 and like should have just gone for something else that's probably like more like what the 370 looks like, or even maybe one of the modern Infinities, you know, I don't know. But it's just hard to design a car that looks like a 240 or a 280 or an E-Type or like all those things that had long bonnets that basically just decapitated anyone that was walking down the sidewalk when they were driving down the road.
Right. I mean, if it were me, I would take their current design and pull the top out a little more so that you effectively have a trapezoid instead of a square. If you look at especially the current gen Nismo 370 front bumper, that's what you get. And I think it's a very simple change. Perhaps that's something similar to what they'll end up doing before we actually get the real version. A man can hope. And who knows what we'll get with the actual Nismo model, which typically features basically a body kit. So high hopes still. Not my favorite on every single angle of the car, but everything else is pretty good. If they told me it was out tomorrow and they gave out all the specs and stuff, I'm not saying that I wouldn't order one because of that front grille.
Yeah. And I mean, I think just looking at the car, you know, there's certainly cars on the market today that are maybe a little more aggressive in terms of like their aerodynamic look or their track focus. You know, this is definitely following the more traditional swoopy, curvy lines of the Z. Again, probably not the most aerodynamically friendly thing for the track. But I think that's a good starting point for the base model in that it gives them a lot of room to work with for the Nismo. I think the car actually represents a good sort of blank canvas in which they can integrate, you know, more aggressive aero onto a car that actually makes it feel like you're buying something special when you shell out the extra dough for the Nismo.
Right, and I don't think doing that exact thing would be very hard to do, even just keeping the same paradigm that they already have, wherein the current Nismo basically adds a big sort of middle splitter, in this new design would be right in the middle of the sort of two tiers that the bumper has. So that immediately would be a big improvement, and maybe that's what we'll get. So I'm not going to write it off automatically just because of a front grille that I'm not a huge fan of. In a similar vein, talking about that sort of side two-tier line that you get, the side profile of the car I actually think is its best angle. Like I said earlier, it shows off how, I believe at least, I'll have to wait until I see it in person, that it's a leaner looking car than the 370. Maybe that means we get some weight loss, or maybe rather, I should say we don't get weight gain with the new technology. I don't expect it to actually, you know, lose 100 pounds or anything. But if it doesn't gain 100 pounds, that would be nice. Again, we didn't get any kind of data like that, and it's a little unfortunate because to me that means that it's probably not a matter of weeks or months until they get ready to.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about that a little bit, right? So we don't have any data, and basically what we mean by that is, you know, for an hour we had this guy that looks like he works in a French art museum talking about how
clearly
sensual the car was. Yeah. So, but we do know something. So we know that's going to be a 3-liter V6.
Yep.
We know it's going to have a couple of turbos strapped to it.
Yep.
We know it's going to have a manual transmission. We know it's going to be rear-wheel drive. It didn't look like it was carbon fiber, so I'm going to assume that's probably a mix of aluminum and some other modern alloys.
Right.
So that being said, we do have maybe, you know, I think it's probably safer to say than speculation that it's going to make more power than the current 370 does, and probably hopefully not be too terribly heavier than the current 370.
Yeah, I think our minimum baseline would be to say that it is just exactly the same drivetrain specs as the current Infinity, which already uses the same motor and transmission based on what we're getting. So that would be 400 horsepower, 350 pound-feet of torque based on the Red Sport specs. I would be surprised to see something less than that, especially in a Nismo model. It would be great if the base model matched the top-end specs of the Infinity, and then the Nismo Z went even beyond that to sort of separate it from the Luxe version into a more track spec model that is both more powerful and lighter than the equivalent Infinity car. I kind of want to rant a little bit on the fact that we don't have those specs, despite the fact that it's 2020. It's been 11 years since the 370 came out, and I'm not saying that in 2010, 1 year after the 370, I was like, oh, okay, when's the next Z? No, obviously, you know, it's not a Call of Duty game, right? They don't come out with a new one every single year. So I'm not going to say
for you.
Yeah, right? They'd make so much money off of me if they did.
How are we not on the 650Z right now?
Yeah, exactly. No, but my point being, it does look like there's a lot of reuse on the car. Earlier I said the door is pretty much the same as my car, the roof is pretty much the same as my car, and that's fine. You know, there's if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But
It's arguably.
but no, my point is, if the only new changes are improved headlight and taillight technology with some new designs to go along with that, much better interior, and the tech to go along with that, right? We've got a full digital dash and stuff. Again, we'll get into the interior, but my point is, those changes don't take 11 years, right? Even if you said, okay, maybe they started 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, whatever. I think those are all things that are kind of shared across the whole Nissan lineup. We got the new Sentra interior last year, or a few months ago at least, for this next model year. And it's already a vast improvement, very similar to the vast improvements that we see in this prototype for the Z. So I don't think those are things that they necessarily waited for the Z for. And the vast amount of reuse makes me wonder why this is even a prototype and why it's not the reveal of the car that we can all order next week. So I'm curious.
Yeah,
but
I mean, that does seem like it's a little bit of a veiled admission that the car is really not at the top of Nissan's sort of corporate model. When you compare that to, say, you know, maybe companies like Ford or, you know, even the European manufacturers, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, right? They sort of use their top of the line performance cars, which, you know I'm getting memed in the comments right now because the top of the line Nissan performance car is in fact the GT-R, not the Z. But setting that aside for a second, you know, for a long time, the Z was Nissan's top of the line performance car. You know, you have to remember that the GT-R wasn't around until 2009. The Z's been around since before Nissan was even a thing. So to them, that really is, to borrow a term that they use quite heavily in this reveal, DNA, right? Nissan's DNA is the Z. It's a rear-wheel drive sports car, sort of an everyman sports car. So in that respect, you kind of have to always compare it to, or at least put it in the context of, the other manufacturers that did similar cars. So when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking of the Toyota Supra, which is probably the biggest competitor to the Z when it comes out.
Especially in this new one,
Yeah. So when you think about that, what did Toyota do for the time that they were redesigning a new car? It's a dual partnership with BMW. It's a totally new, I mean, not even close in terms of interior and exterior design and all those things. Now, granted, there's a 2019 370Z that you can buy, and they're showing this one off in 2020. So, you know, I'll give them something for that. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at the revolutions that have happened in other sort of similar leaps and bounds that we would expect to see with a reveal that had this level of hype, are really not there. I mean, it's a fantastic looking car. I'm going to dock them a little bit of points for the front grille. Hopefully they'll work that on the Nismo. But, you know, the rest of the car looks fantastic. The interior, I thought, looked absolutely phenomenal, especially compared to riding in something like this. That interior makes it really look like they did the jump from the 90s Supra to the 2020 Supra. You know, even though the Z is it's a current production car and doesn't have an interior that is nearly, you know, on par in terms of looks.
Right. I mean, what we got with this unveiling was another incremental change, which is fine. I mean, that's actually a good thing, right? It means we don't lose the vast amount of aftermarket support we already have for that drivetrain. It means we don't have to pay a significant increase in price. I'm sure it'll be a little more expensive than the current model just because of inflation and technology changes and things like that. But this isn't going to be like the change to an $80,000 mid-engine Z to compete with the Corvette or something like that, right? It's an incremental change from the 370. And in doing that, I can't believe that it took 11 years to get here.
They're not releasing any hard specs. It was all focused on the design. Not really any details related to the car. Even the videography that we got was like a 1-second clip through the passenger side of the car to see the interior. You know, so we're not really getting what the full bread and butter Z will look like. And to me, I don't necessarily take that to mean that the car is not done or that it's bad. I think that's more an indication of the fact that Nissan really is sort of maybe closer to an afterthought with this car than they are to a full-fledged, totally redesigned prototype.
Right, and you mentioned before that, you know, we don't want to forget about the GT-R, right? It's not like we're expecting the Z to come out and compete with Lambo and Ferrari for like the top budget performance that you can get or anything, right? They have the GT-R for that, and there is rumor that the GT-R could be going away as soon as 2022. I expect that just means the R35 is going away, but that's another video entirely. But what I mean to say is, if you want an analogy for this, you kind of have to think about the difference between something like a battleship and a flagship, right? The flagship is sort of the icon car, but it may not be the heavy hitter. And I think that's kind of always the way it's been with the GT-R and the Z. The Z is that everyman car. It's got the cool logo. It's got the prestige and the history behind it. And it's not that the GT-R doesn't have those things, but the GT-R has kind of been its own monster.
And I mean, Nissan is certainly not the first manufacturer to have that kind of duality, right? Even in American terms, we have GM, we've got the Camaro, and then we've got the Corvette. In Ford, we've got the Mustang, and then we got the Ford GT, right? So the GT-R is really trying to punch legitimately in the supercar territory. No one is expecting that from a Z.
Right. And we really wouldn't want it to, right? Because we want to maintain that affordable price range. There's a reason I traded my GT-R intentionally for a 370Z, and I'm able to do a race build with the 370 that is actually using real substantial parts because I'm not paying for that GT-R anymore, right? So I'm not asking for a Ferrari competitor out of the Z or something like that. All that to be said, some of the bashing that we're doing in this clip is more a bashing of the unveiling and the marketing decisions and the business decisions that Nissan has made, not of the car, right? When that car rolled out on stage, I wasn't like, oh, time to turn this video off, I'm done, time to sell the Z and buy a BMW again or something. I'm by no means disappointed in that. I'm just surprised that it took us so long and there was so much hype for this. It's actually very much the inverse of the Toyota situation where we suddenly got a real new Supra with a ridiculous, incredible prototype. And then we took 10 years to get the real thing and we're kind of disappointed by the real thing. It's been the other way around here. Also, I think we'd be remiss not to mention Carlos Ghosn and the potentially detrimental financial situation Nissan has been in over the past decade.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why when I say this car's an afterthought for them, really, it's an afterthought that probably a lot of people in the company below the C-suite were having, but no one could actually afford to, get their feet wet.
Nissan has never been, nor should we expect them to be, Porsche with the world's largest research and development budget. They have to make money first so that we can get cars like this. Whereas with some companies, it's the other way around. Nissan sells the Altima and the Leaf and the Versa. Those things have to make them enough money so that they can play with toys.
Well, I don't know. Chevy has to sell the Cruze and the Bolt and the
Yeah, but Chevy's CEO didn't run away in a shipping
That's true. He didn't.
Now, let's not get too far into that because I've seen some crazy details and conspiracy theories and who knows. Seems like Carlos Ghosn may have screwed them over. Maybe they screwed him over. Either way, the point is something was very wrong there. And I think that there's a non-zero effect that has had on Nissan's ability to innovate.
As long as we're being critical of the reveal, I mean, I don't think it was necessarily an unsuccessful reveal.
No, for sure.
I think
the hype was there.
Yeah, I think you could easily make a montage parody video of just clipping what the two designers were saying on stage.
Yeah.
Because literally the guy in the pinstripe suit, I mean, I don't even know, like, that guy's life is just lit. I don't know what he's doing.
What did he say? The sensual muscularity?
I mean, he literally embodies being in love with your car. But one thing that I think, despite the meminess and the cheesiness of what they were saying, I got the sense that both of them were extremely passionate about the car.
Oh, for sure.
Which is actually not something that I see in similar, like, these hype reveals that we're used to seeing. I mean, even if you think about, like, the most overhyped and probably the most ridiculous in terms of, like, fanfare and press coverage that we get from auto reveals, it's actually from Tesla, where you've got Elon Musk, billionaire guy that
with a sledgehammer.
Seems like he climbed down from, Mount Olympus to come, fraternize among the poor folks down here. And, that's actually part of their business model, right? They're trying to actually sell you the car before it's even been, forget about a prototype. This car is a one-of that they have on the stage.
They have to sell the spots in order to be able to afford
Right, exactly. So, what their whole move is, okay, we did this whole, giant carnival experience, pre-order your Cybertruck at $100 a pop, and basically hedge fund us to go through the rest of the development.
Right.
So, you can kind of contrast that with maybe something like the C8 Corvette, which is a fully baked car that they've had under wraps for
2008 or something
for
like that.
almost a decade, that they're trying to not spill to the public so that they can actually come out and be like, okay, this is the price, this is the horsepower, this is when you can expect to see it, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So, sort of looking at those two different paradigms, I would say the Z reveal probably falls somewhere in the middle. It's like they wanted the hype of a Tesla, but they have none of the details of a Corvette.
Right.
And so, even in between that, which I would say is probably not well done in terms of actually telling us something about the car, actually giving us information that makes people want to buy it, makes people excited to, take delivery of it. It was more kind of a love story about how much Nissan loves the Z,
right.
which, even though cheesy, I kind of bought because of how much the designers really act. We had the guy that comes out and says, "Oh, the Z was my first car." We've got, Louis Pierre talking about how sensual the car is. We've got another guy that's straight out of an anime talking about how amazing the car is. I really did feel like, now that being said, we had Adam Carolla, who was like, "Why are you even here?" shouting from a Teams meeting about how much he loves Z days.
At ZCon, yeah.
Right. So, but, even Adam Carolla, you take him out of it, all the people that were there at ZCon, that was a real event that was actually happening in Tennessee, halfway around the world from where this reveal was happening, and they had it all together. So I really do believe that the backing for the car is there, the community for the car is there, the want for the car is there. Hopefully they won't screw up the price range and make it so that, 50% of people that buy Zs are 20-year-olds that can buy nothing else. So, hopefully they won't price them out of it. But, all that being said, I really did feel like the people that were in charge of bringing the Z to production actually wanted to do just that. They weren't there to make money. They weren't there to kind of spin the Carlos Ghosn BS into some positive story. They actually genuinely wanted to bring a new Z to the customer.
Right. There's no doubt that, disregarding any corporate hierarchy, people in that company care about the Z, and hopefully the product will reflect that. And I believe it will. I think it always has, and I don't see any reason for that to change. It may just be that we get it later because of the financial side of things that corporate is dealing with, and they have to sort of get the emotions out of the way in order to deal with those things first. But let's get back to the car for a little bit. I noticed a couple cool Easter eggs in there. If you zoom in on the dash, you see this stock photo car has 1,969 kilometers. That's a reference to 1969, the first year that the car came out. It's got 370 miles of range, or 370 kilometers of range in the fuel tank. So obviously a reference to the current car. We got the 3-gauge centerpiece, which I think is an icon of the Z, especially if they're going for that 240Z retro homage. And I was going to be really sad to lose that in favor of a digital display, but at the same time I was ready to accept it, because what was more important than design aesthetic for me was getting an improvement in interior technology. You can zoom in on them in the renderings and see that we toss out the clock from the 370. Really happy to see that. It's useless and it's not in sync with the digital display anyway, so you have two clocks and one's always wrong. That's normally the right gauge. The right gauge in this example is a voltmeter, back like it was in the 350Z. That's fine. It's never been the most useful gauge in my opinion, but I'll take it over a clock any day, especially when it's not even the only clock. The middle gauge says turbo on it, and it goes from 0 to 25, I believe I said. I don't have my notes in front of me. Not sure what that is, because the left gauge says boost, and it goes from like -10 to 20 to +20.
I mean, maybe they put 25 turbos on it. You don't know.
Nah, I'm pretty sure I know. So on further review, this actually turns out to be a gauge that indicates RPMs on the turbo. At the very least, that's more interesting than the clock. Let's talk about that as we move over to the digital dash, which does appear to have configurable gauges on it. In the same rendering, we see oil temp, oil pressure, and two others. Didn't really note those down because I was just too excited about having both oil temp and oil pressure. I'm very, very excited to see a fully digital dash. I've always loved the Zs, I've always owned them, but my biggest hidden or not so hidden complaint has been that I would love to have a daily for 90% of situations where I'm not in an autocross or on a track, where I have all the high-tech stuff of most cars since like 2015.
Yeah, and I mean, a digital display is not exactly some new age tech out here. I mean, the GT-R pioneered that literally 10 years ago. So, I think that's probably been coming. Had they released another Z that had orange analog gauges in the gauge cluster, that would have been like, all right, boys, like you maybe went.
But even the GT-R still had analog gauges. It had a small digital display in the dash. But the thing about the GT-R was you always had that center display that was built by Polyphony, the people behind Gran Turismo. So it didn't really matter what else you had on the car. You could throw things up on that screen that if you're the type of driver that actually cared, you always had everything you needed. Whereas on the Zs, people that modify their cars or race their cars and stuff, we're always dealing with either just missing information or having to add in our own data systems.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it looked good. You could tell that in the reveal video, they had some type of like pre-programmed sort of video to play on the digital display because the car was revving to apparently $7,000, even though it was stationary and not turned on. So, that's a cool feature. I also think that, this is maybe where Nissan can actually make one of the biggest leaps in terms of interior, because literally the Z in its current form has been around more or less since like the early 2000s.
Yep.
So the fact that we're finally seeing like, oh, this actually looks like, a luxury Grand Tour or a high-tech track car, like, that's the kind of thing that they can actually really play with now. I don't know that they really hit that mark with the body, but I think as far as the interior, it definitely looks, A+, a big giant step in the right direction in terms of what the previous car had.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the 370 was a major change in quality from the 350. I say this as someone who's had two 350s and one 370. The layout is pretty much identical. Not that there was ever really anything wrong with the layout. I thought it was driver oriented, but it was always sort of cheap plastics. And in the 350 especially, if you live in a hot climate, you had this sort of rubberized coating that would actually just scratch off and completely change the color of your dash and look like your cat got loose in there or something, And the 370 was personally a huge step up for me because it was like, oh, there's a little bit more leather in here or pseudo leather. That was nice, but it wasn't like the jump that other manufacturers, particularly German manufacturers, made in technology, right? We got the same sort of gauges, just with some nicer fonts and stuff and nicer colors. But everything else was the same, just a little bit less plastic.
Yeah, and I think, again, we only saw, less than 1 minute peek through the passenger side of what the interior really looked like. From that peek, though, I think the interior looked great. So we've covered the body, covered the interior. Is there anything else that strikes you as far as the reveal went, that you learned or that you saw of the car today?
Just speaking from someone who's had the last two generations, I would say my key points are, thank God they finally integrated the door handle. The door handle has been terrible on both of the last two cars. I mean, it's a little bit better on the 370, but honestly, if this car wasn't silver, you'd have this huge honkering silver thing sticking out of the 350 was like, there was like braille on the outside of or something. It's hard to explain. It was just really bad, and sometimes they would break. They kept the 3 center gauges. I wanted to see that aesthetic carry through from the 240 all the way to the new one. And otherwise, I think they just integrated the older retro callbacks pretty well.
Okay. So we don't know a lot about the car right now.
Right.
Even though we've had a couple teasers, a reveal. Right. The last car's been around for like 200 years, But all that being said, based on what you know right now, what do you think is your number one? I really like this about it. I'm glad they did this. What really sticks out to you?
It's got to be the interior. I mean, if you told me that in 2016 or whatever, 2017, the year after my car, the new Z was coming out, it was just a very incremental change. The body wasn't even different or whatever, but they just upgraded the interior. That's like almost to the level where I would just trade my car in on 1 year newer car just for the better interior. I mean, that was a major pain point in all of the previous cars, and honestly, all of previous Nissans across their lineup. The 2020 Frontier is, guys, it's the same as the 2003, like 17 years plus has not changed anything. It's pathetic. That and the fact that we're going back to a turbo motor, it's going to be more power efficient, probably going to be a lot more effective in the aftermarket as well. It's basically a baby GT-R motor, and the Infiniti guys have already seen the success of that.
Okay, so that's what you like about it. What's the number one thing you don't like about it?
The front grille. Honestly, I think over the past 11 years of waiting on the next car, the aggressive lines of the 370 have really grown on me, especially coming from a 350, where in 2009 I was kind of like, I don't know, I still like the 350 better. It's very smooth. It's a leaner looking car. It doesn't look as much like a hatchback because the rear is a little bit bloated on the 370. But you get all these sharp lines and you get this really aerodynamic looking front bumper, especially on the Nismo models. The looks are there, and I just don't see that on the new car.
I agree with you that I think the front grille is what I would maybe send that one back a couple levels down in Nissan to have somebody else work on that. Thinking about that though, I this is probably a hot take, but I genuinely think if I saw them next to each other in person, I wonder if I would think the 370 Nismo is a better looking car. Probably not the base 370. I'm not going to troll that hard and say the regular, 2009 370Z looks better than the one we just saw.
Right.
But I think, a new 370 Nismo actually is a pretty good looking car. I think they had a tough act to follow. I don't know they did it in the front end. I think they didn't do themselves any favors by bringing the car out in like canary puke.
Yeah,
yellow.
actually, we
I'm
didn't
not
take
sure
much
what's up
time.
with that.
We didn't take much time to talk about the color. I actually wonder how much of our grille complaints would go away if it was in like silver. Obviously I'm biased. Typically, the darker colors like black kind of hide the lines. In this case, I think the car was actually so bright that it hid the lines. There were certain angles where, especially with the lighting on stage, you couldn't even see the lines in the hood or on the body. Whereas if you get a nice side profile view with some shadows in there, it's actually a really mean looking car.
Yeah, I think actually, had they brought it out in black, it would have hid how sort of nasty the grille looked. So black hides lines, and in this case, the lines in the front were not that great, so it would have made it look a little bit better.
Right.
I think what they really probably need to do, and this is the last thing I'll say, and we'll get off the hood, I promise, but they need to make that grille look more like a 370, or at least like a real 240 where there is some separation. It's not just this giant cutout in the front of the car. They have literally like yellow bumper all around this giant hole in the front of the car, which just looks really like kind of unfinished and not really thought out. So I think, maybe the Nismo model will see a more sort of fleshed out version of whatever that is supposed to actually look like.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for all our complaints, I think it's very simple changes away from exactly how I would have designed it. And that's not to say I'm an expert, but, I'm an expert.
One thing that actually really stood out to me when they rolled the car out was that terrible, I don't like yellow cars in general, but I really didn't like that yellow. It looks like my Ryobi electric drill
Actually,
kit.
it is almost exactly that color, but let me tell you, it looks great on a Lotus.
One thing that was very easy to see in that color was the fact that they had paint matched the Brembos to the body color, and I think those are the largest brakes we've ever seen on a Z.
Yeah, so I think it's fair enough to say that those are obviously the current R35 GT-R brakes, which is honestly, that's awesome. The current brakes on the 370 are really nothing to complain about. Especially if you have the sport model at least.
But ice mode.
So that's the thing is, size-wise, performance-wise, they're not that bad, but I'm going to be really happy to see just a new brake set in general because of some issues that we've seen in the motorsports world on the 370s, particularly with what you wouldn't technically call ice mode, but that's a video for another day.
What is it going to take for you as a long-term Z owner, a fan of the brand, a fan of Nissan, to pre-order this car day one when it gets announced for pre-release?
Okay, I'd like to see some improvements in the bumper. I'd like to see a Nismo model. Maybe those two things will go hand in hand. I'd like to see the price stay under 50 grand. Okay, we totally actually didn't talk about the drivetrain potential because they didn't mention anything, but I assume that we're getting the same slush box auto in addition to the manual. So obviously I would just buy a manual, that's not a question. But if they came out with a DCT, I would actually strongly consider that. They're probably not going to, that's a moot point. I would like to see either the same or minor improvements on the suspension geometry. I don't want them to sacrifice that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. I have not seen anything online, Instagram, social media, otherwise. Certainly didn't see anything in the reveal to indicate what the suspension actually is. The Z's have always been, double wishbone, full independent suspension, which is a big reason why the cars have the sort of everyman performance that they're talking about. They certainly don't have the power of some of their, European and American brothers, but they've always kind of had the suspension tunability and the sort of genuine track-focused suspension geometry that we don't see from people like BMW, from people like Ford, from people like GM. So that being said, I assume they didn't throw that away.
Yeah, and actually I think the fact that they haven't mentioned anything like the drivetrain is actually probably a good thing in terms of what we're actually going to get. If at the very least it means more of the same, then that's good. I mean, the 370 geometry is fine. The Infinity drivetrain is fine. You throw a newer body on that with more technology and it's not a bad car.
One thing I don't want to see thrown in, I would love to see the 370's chassis and suspension, wheel wells with big fat tires.
Yes, actually that's a major point.
What I don't want to see is the Infinity's weight. The Infinity weighs almost 4,000 pounds.
Right, but the Infinity has a lot more tech. It's available in all-wheel drive. That's where some of the top trim weight comes from as well. And it's got a lot more cushiness inside.
I mean, I think if they really want to sort of maintain the Z's current trackability, the car needs to stay under 35.
I agree, yeah.
The Supra is way less than 35. I mean, obviously the Corvette and other sort of more supercar-y type things way less than 35, but the Z really needs to come in under 35.
Something to note is that for the last decade and a half, the Z has slowly crept up from 3,300 pounds to just under 3,500 pounds. So with all the new tech, I'm not surprised if there's going to be a slight change in weight, but I think they really need to be at or below that 3,500 mark still, or as close to it as possible if it's not going to be a big disappointment.
Yeah, I mean, if they come out at 35,
03.
60, yeah, then I'll be all right. But if it's a 36, 37, 38 mess, like, not to call the GT-R a mess, but it is quite a heavy car given its performance. The
Right.
Infinities are obviously giant couches. So if it's anything like that, that is definitely not 240-esque at all. It's not even 300Z-esque at all.
So looking at the design, I think from some side profile views, I think it is a leaner looking body, and the 370 already has all the modern safety features. So I think if you can fit the same stuff in a leaner body, then you're going to be equal or lesser in weight. Then perhaps we balance that out with the new tech that's going to add some weight inside, and we'll see. But hopefully they can do it.
What I think they're going to get in trouble is they've got 2 turbos sitting on it now.
Yeah.
That's going to add some weight. So I'll give them 100 pounds for that. But everything else should be left at the same weight or less than what the current Z is.
Again, it's sort of my do I buy it checklist. We're going to add weight to that. If it gains a lot of weight, why would I get a heavier race car?
Assuming that they have maintained their double wishbone suspension, assuming that it's going to come on big wheels and tires, which it looks like, as we saw the Nissan Z Dunlop Durezzo, which is not a thing, but whatever. It looked like it was on some pretty fat boy tires, which is going to be absolutely fantastic in terms of the car's handling and trackability.
Yeah, so I think regardless of what we might say about the front grille, I think we might truly have a car that sits sort of somewhere in between that 2003 350Z accessibility range and the GT-R sort of supercar killer. Whereas now in this price creep, weight creep range of $40-something thousand and 3,400 something pounds, we've sort of perhaps peaked out in that range where we actually should be.
Yeah, and so that brings up a big question mark, which was not answered by the reveal and has not been answered by Nissan to date, which is how much is it really going to be?
Yeah.
I think that it would be probably fair, I'll say fair, for a car like that, based on what we saw and based on what we know, which again is not much, that it's somewhere in the 40s to 50s, something like that. That's probably like Supra, base M2 level stuff.
Right.
But, given that all new car, lots of other factors troubling Nissan right now, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me if we see something like upper 50s, 60s, maybe even 70 grand for a Z, which is far beyond anything that, the previous Zs were. It's probably going to be troublesome for Nissan to sell a car like that when you have things like the Cayman, the Corvette.
Yeah, if we're going to create some sort of terrace markers here, at 46,000-ish is about where you're at with the top end of the Z right now, which people already complain about. I'll even complain about that. I got this car for 29 grand, and in the price difference between this car and a brand new Nismo, I've done a complete relatively high-end autocross build. I've still got some stuff to do on it, but in terms of big ticket items, we're already there for roughly the price of a brand new one. And what's the cost of that? 20,000 miles in one owner? Not a big deal at all. Everything else about the car is pretty much the same.
Yeah, and you have to look at what else is available in that price range, right? So we've got the Supra. Supras are don't quote me, but in the 50s, you can have one all
Yeah,
day.
I think low 50s is sort of your, let me just go to the dealer and pick out my color.
Right. So it'd probably be a far cry for Nissan to ask more than the Supra
Yeah.
for a
I think-
370Z.
I think
whatever it's
really,
gonna be.
especially with the primary difference being that the Z could be a little heavier, but it's going to be a little more powerful and a little bigger in terms of things like brakes and wheels and tires and stuff. The Supra really is its target competitor, and for it to be equal in price to that is going to be a significant price creep from the current model, but still perhaps acceptable if the performance is there. Whereas being more than that starts to get egregious. And then if you honestly think that it's going to be anywhere in the 60s or approaching Corvette and Cayman territory, then what are you doing? No one's going to buy that.
Assuming they set it right at, or 2, 3, maybe $5,000 more than a Supra.
Yeah.
The average consumer is going to be like, oh,
This
Supra
or
makes
Supra.
this.
Yeah.
350 makes this. Okay, I'm gonna get that. So
Right, then it becomes a sort of comparison of preferences and features, not a class of car change,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I mean, I think as long as they make more power than the Supra, which I think they're on track to do,
Yeah.
they'll be fine.
Yeah. Hopefully we get all of that and it's still around the same price, which would be great. I expect a couple of grand in price creep at minimum. But again, it's 2020, so anything can happen.
All right, so stay tuned for the next video where Aaron orders a 2020 Supra because the Z is trash.
That's definitely not going to happen, but whether or not we get a pre-ordering and configuring my new Z video in the future will depend on how quickly and how cheaply they can come out with it.
Like and subscribe if you want to see Aaron pre-order the new Z. That'll probably be 3 years from now when it actually comes out, but we're really excited to see it, and overall I think they did a good job.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I think it's at least what we wanted, if not even better, hopefully, and maybe they'll get a little front grille fixed for us.